In the evening, when I went on stage in front of 1,000 investors and was about to say the usual "we exceeded the plan," the spotlights hit my eyes, and on the main screen, a recording from my office was playing without sound, where I, at a dark walnut table, was signing a folder with the logo of a competing company and nodding to an invisible interlocutor. The hall was silent, the hall was choked with air, and I realized that this was not a technical error, because in a second, tax officers, the press, and my former partner, who 2 years ago swore that he would rather burn himself than betray me, appeared at the door. I said into the microphone that the recording was fake, but the voice from the director's office overdubbed the sound, my timbre, my intonation, my agreed for 200,000 in cash, and even my pauses between words, known only to those who listened to me too carefully, and I felt my name, which I had hammered on the brick, crackle as calmly as ice cracks under the wheels of a too-heavy car. I was not arrested, I was allowed to speak, and that was worse, because silence can still be explained by shyness, and words always explain only weakness, and when the first flashes of the cameras swept over my face, I saw my mother in the front row, who stood up, holding onto the back of her chair, and I saw in her eyes the work of all our generations, gathered into a fist and raised to strike. "Tell me it's a montage," she said with the same firmness with which she had once said that sugar was bad and that promises were kept in this family. "It's a montage," I said, feeling my tongue stick to the roof of my mouth because I didn't know who the person sitting off-screen was, and I didn't know why the envelope on the table had the correct contract number, and I didn't know when my voice, my signature, and the confidence that I had control over anything but the rate of my own breathing had been stolen from me. My ex-partner raised his hand, ahead of the reporters, and asked me to look up, where a spreadsheet of offshore transfers opened on a second screen, and I recognized the account for my father's foundation we had set up for scholarships, because numbers don't lie when they're manipulated by someone with the keys to the safe, and I saw my own electronic signature in the bottom corner, executed so neatly that even my paranoia, which had been measuring the security guard's steps this morning, was silenced. "You did it for the deal," he said. "I didn't do it," I replied, and what should have been a shout came out like an explanation at customs. I was asked to leave the room for a minute of clarification, but I walked through the corridor of cells, where the flashes were like jury verdicts, and I realized that this minute would never end, because everything I was had just become evidence against me, and if this wasn't a montage, then it was someone else's ability to be me better than I was, and here I thought for the first time that the worst betrayal begins with believing in your own infallibility for too long, and I thought so clearly that I wanted to admit to a crime I didn't commit, if only someone would quickly turn off the lights. The next morning, I woke up not in a penthouse but in an apartment I had once kept for a rainy day, an irony that could now be written down in a self-destruction textbook. The phone was ringing, lawyers, analysts, relatives, the press. But no one called to ask how I was. Everyone was asking just one thing: is it true? In my world, the question "is it true" sounded like a sentence, because the truth costs more than a lie, but no one is willing to pay. When I turned on the TV, the main channel was showing a story called Empire on Blood, and I saw myself, the same one who had been sitting in an expensive suit, joking with a journalist, saying that success was honesty multiplied by discipline. Now the caption under that video read, "Hypocrite of the Year." I kept the screen on, I wanted to see how far they would go. They showed me photos of my villa, my watch, my father, who had died 10 years ago, but was now called the fictitious director of the fund. I didn't feel angry. Only a strange coldness. Like when I first realized that love could also be signed into a contract. A few hours later, my financial director arrived, the only one who hadn't yet kicked me out of my life. He put a folder on the table, as thick as my former confidence, and said, "This isn't just a leak. This is systematic work. Your letters are fake, but they were issued through the same channels as the real documents. Someone had access from the inside. Any one of us?" He didn't answer, just looked through me, like through a window where a house is on fire, but you're still in no hurry to put it out. That evening, I was officially removed from managing the holding company. The board of directors voted unanimously. People who a week ago had called me a visionary were now afraid to even look me in the eye. I left the hall without saying a word. Because words are the first luxury that is taken away from you. When I returned home, journalists were standing at the entrance. They shouted, "Do you understand that thousands of jobs have been destroyed? How much money have you kept for yourself? Is it true that the minister covered for you?" I was silent. One of them said. He is silent because he is guilty. And for the first time all day I smiled. Because not being silent would have meant playing a role again. And I was no longer an actor in my own play. The next day I received a message anonymous, without a signature. You are being destroyed not for what you did, but for what you know. I reread it dozens of times. And I realized that everything was just beginning. Because the worst thing about betrayal is not that you are not believed. It is that you are made to doubt yourself so deeply that you begin to check whether your hands are really still yours. And when I looked in the mirror, I no longer recognized the person who was looking back. I hadn't left my apartment for days. My phone was off, I didn't need lawyers or excuses. I wanted silence to hear where the fall had started. But instead of silence, all I could hear was my own pulse beating somewhere in my temples, like a clock counting down the last minutes of my former life. On the third night, there was a knock on the door. Carefully, twice. I thought it was the press again, but when I opened it, there it was. Sophia. She had once worked as my analyst, and then disappeared after a scandalous project that I had ordered buried. I don't need an explanation, she said, not waiting for an invitation. I know it's not you. I wanted to ask where she was so sure of herself, but she was already spreading out documents on the table, copies of correspondence, bank statements, internal memos with timestamps. Someone rewrote your story, she said. And did it a year ago. All that came out now was a script that had been in the making for a long time. I sat down opposite her. Who? Your partner, Arthur. But he's just an executor. The customer is people who are afraid that you know more than you should know. I was silent while she spoke, but every word fell on me like a stone into water. Arthur. The person I trusted with the business, to whom I gave a second life. His daughter called me Uncle Mark. They framed you, using your father's fund, Sophia continued. But the real account was not opened by you, but by him. And there's not 200,000, but 20 million floating there. I looked at her, and I was scared not because of the amount, but because it all sounded plausible. Too plausible. She took out a flash drive. It's all here. Documents, records, even correspondence with his lawyers. But if you open it, there's no going back. Are you sure I want to see it? I'm sure you won't survive without it. When she left, I sat in the dark with that flash drive in my hand, like a grenade without a fuse. It wasn't the truth that scared me, it was what I was going to do with it that scared me. I got up, turned on my laptop, and inserted the flash drive. Letters, contracts, meeting transcripts, and drawn-up plans opened on the screen, how exactly I was to be destroyed from within. The last file contained an audio recording. Arthur's voice, cold and confident. When it falls, we'll pick up the pieces. And from the pieces, we'll build a new empire. Without a name, without a conscience, but with money. I didn't turn off the sound. I listened to the end. Because only now did I understand that I wasn't betrayed for money. I was betrayed for the idea that the system didn't need people. And I was its first experiment. At that moment, I realized that the only way to survive was to stop being who I was. Because to get your name back, sometimes you have to become a shadow. I decided not to call lawyers. I decided not to play by the rules of those who fabricated my guilt. Every step had to be a human sentence, simple, cold, and without a chance of appeal. I knew I would lose more than my reputation, but sometimes the truth demands a price you pay yourself. The night before leaving was sleepless. I reread the letters on the flash drive, learned to feel the pauses in other people's phrases, found the veils between the paragraphs that indicated meeting places and phone numbers that intersected in two different offshores. I called only one person, Sophia. She arrived silently and brought with her old contracts, copies that were stored somewhere as spare keys. I ordered her to stay in the shadows. In the morning I arrived at headquarters. The cameras, the security, the people with access cards, everything that had once been a barrier between me and the world had now become a canvas for my performance. I asked not to organize a press conference. I asked not to call the lawyers. I had a different plan. I wanted to speak their language, the language of evidence, which cannot be erased by pause or editing. At the reception desk, I left an envelope with a flash drive and a note: "If you want to know the truth, look inside. But remember, the truth kills those who hide it." Then I went to Arthur's office. He sat as if he were expecting the promised triumph. I went to the middle, did not raise my voice. The people around me felt that something else was beginning, not a trial, but a question of conscience. I put my laptop in front of him and pressed play. There was not only his voice, but the voices of those he hired, his laughter after each point of the plan, his request to the lawyers to paint over the documents so that they'd look old. I looked into his eyes and saw the confidence melting in them. There is no place to retreat when the evidence speaks louder than fear. He tried to lie. Briefly. "No one can do it better. This is compromising material," he said. "Ordered by competitors," another added. I replied simply, "You knew you would pay for it. You knew you would break people." I did not call the police. I gave them a choice I had never given before: the truth on their terms or the truth in public. I found myself with the letters and notes open, and I realized that the hardest thing was not to win this battle. The hardest thing was not to betray myself in the process of winning. I could use this material to crush Arthur, his allies, their networks. I could take revenge, and nothing would be left of the revenge but ruins. But I could also put everything out in the open: signed documents, audio recordings, transactions, everything. I chose the other. I did what seemed impossible for someone who had spent their whole lives caring about control. I took off the mask of my own image and told the truth that was not in the records, about the mistakes, about the tricks, about how I once turned a blind eye to growing an empire. I said what I had done that hurt, and that I was ready to answer. And then, when the public's eyes fell on me, I opened the flash drive live. As the bundles of documents flew across the table, I handed some to investigators, some to journalists, but most importantly, I left a record where I admitted my mistakes and exposed those who turned my guilt into a business model. It was an all-or-nothing bet. I risked not only my career, but also the safety of my loved ones. I know this. But sometimes, to stop the machine that crushes people under the tires of corporate interests, you have to get under the wheels yourself. And as I left the building, not knowing what would happen next, I felt a strange lightness, not victory, but the freedom of choice that comes only after you have paid for your own sins. I stepped out onto the rusting boat of the world I had once built, and the first thing I felt was not repentance or triumph, but devastation that had its own smell, a mixture of rain on precious stone and ashes from what had burned at night while I slept. When the news spread the documents, some people applauded, others wanted to move on, because they were more comfortable living with a new person in the chair, even if he was a fake. But the voices asking something else, not who is to blame, but what to do next, became more numerous. I tried to answer. I spoke for a long time, without pauses, so that even breathing seemed like a speech. I spoke about systems that breed ruthlessness, about how we replace names with balance sheets and people with positions on reports, and that sometimes the answer to betrayal should not be another betrayal, but a change in the rules of the game. People cried. Some laughed. Someone shouted that it was all my fault. And I realized that neither my openness nor my public self-criticism would bring back anything to those who had suffered. They would only open the way to two possibilities: to repeat the mistake or to learn not to repeat it. "Did you think about turning it back?" a woman asked me during the live broadcast, and her voice was simple, like a question in the dark. "I thought about changing what I could," I replied, and there was less pathos in the words than a desire not to ruin someone else's day. The moral of all this did not appear instantly. It was born in the lines of lawsuits, in conversations with people I had offended, in the new rules that we began to implement together in companies where the cult of results at any cost had previously reigned. I gave some control of the foundation to independent committees, reduced my stake in the structures, opened up access to the archives, not because it made me a saint, but because I was tired of the situational truth that lives in the pockets of lawyers. People came with their stories, some asked for forgiveness, others for retribution. I listened and understood the main thing: wealth does not make you good or bad, it simply multiplies the consequences of your choices, and the only real test is whether you accept responsibility when you make a mistake. I still do not know if it is possible to be rich and honest at the same time. All I know is that after my name was slandered, I had the opportunity to choose a different formula for success: not profit above all else, but resilience, transparency, and a promise not to hide the truth, even when it hurts. When I look at the river, it still flows, and time does not turn back anything, but sometimes the water carries with it some small remains, fragments, letters, lost keys, and I think with inspiration that something else can be built from the fragments. The question, can the past be redeemed, remains open, like a door that still needs to be passed through. The answer will depend not on me alone, but on all who agree to fight for a different meaning of success, and if this fight ends in defeat, then I will accept it in the same way as I accepted my fall, as a lesson that still needs to be repeated until it becomes the truth.